You're in the middle of a conversation and someone makes a point that's just slightly off. Not wrong enough to matter, not worth correcting. Everyone else nods and moves on. But you can't. Your brain is already 3 layers deep, tracing the flaw in the logic, mapping the implications if that assumption is wrong, wondering why no one else caught it, and simultaneously wondering why you can't just let it go like everyone else seems to. You smile. You say nothing. And somewhere in the background, a quieter thought surfaces. Why does this always happen to me? If that sounds familiar, stay with me. Because what I'm about to show you isn't just about being intelligent. It's about what extremely high intelligence actually does to a brain, and why it comes with costs that almost nobody talks about. If you already know this feeling, subscribe. This channel is built for exactly this kind of mind. Here's the thing about high IQ that most people get wrong. They think it's a superpower, a clean upgrade, like being handed a faster processor that just runs everything better. It isn't. High intelligence is more like having a nervous system that won't stop working, one that processes more, notices more, and connects more, whether you want it to or not. And that distinction changes everything. Let's start with the most misunderstood part. Psychologists who study exceptionally intelligent people, typically defined as those scoring above 130 on standardized IQ assessments, placing them in roughly the top 2%, consistently find something surprising. These individuals don't just think faster, they think differently. Their brains don't follow the same path from A to B. They often skip straight to G, then loop back to C, and arrive at a conclusion that's technically correct, but almost impossible to explain to someone who didn't take the same invisible route. Researchers call this divergent processing. Where most brains move through information in a fairly linear way, high IQ brains branch constantly. They generate multiple associations simultaneously. One thought doesn't lead to the next. It leads to several nexts all at once. Here's where it gets interesting. That same branching that makes someone exceptional at solving complex problems is the exact same mechanism that makes it nearly impossible to turn the brain off. The mind that finds a brilliant solution at 11 p.m. is the same mind that cannot stop generating solutions at 2 a.m. when you're trying to sleep. This is why so many people with very high IQs report a specific kind of exhaustion. Not the tiredness of doing too much, the tiredness of a brain that never fully stops. And it gets lonelier than that. One of the least discussed psychological patterns in highly intelligent adults is what researchers call intellectual isolation. Not social isolation necessarily, though that often follows, but a specific experience of being unable to find conversations that match the speed and depth of your own internal world. Think about what that actually feels like day to day. You're at a work meeting. The discussion is happening at one frequency and your brain is running at another. You can follow the conversation, you can participate, but it requires a kind of deliberate downshifting, like driving a sports car in a school zone. You can do it. But it costs something. Psychologist Lita Hollingworth, one of the earliest researchers to study highly gifted individuals, documented this pattern as far back as the 1940s. She found that children with IQs above 150 had significant difficulty finding intellectual peers, not because they were arrogant or difficult, but simply because the gap in processing speed made sustained mutual engagement genuinely hard. And here's the part nobody warns you about. That difficulty doesn't disappear in adulthood. It just becomes more politely managed. Now, before the comment section explodes, I'm not saying intelligent people are better than everyone else. That's not what this is about. What I'm saying is that a brain calibrated for a certain kind of depth will experience friction in a world largely built for a different register. That friction has a psychological cost, and that cost is real. Let's go deeper. There's a concept in psychology called overexcitability, first documented by Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski. He wasn't studying IQ specifically. He was studying exceptionally creative and gifted individuals, but his findings overlap almost perfectly with what we now know about high IQ psychology. Dabrowski identified 5 types of overexcitability that cluster in intellectually intense individuals: psychomotor, an excess of physical energy; sensory, heightened sensitivity to stimuli that others filter out; intellectual, an almost compulsive need to analyze, question, and understand; imaginational, a rich internal world that runs parallel to external reality. And emotional, intensity of feeling that seems disproportionate to the triggering event. The key word here is intensity, not in the dramatic sense, in the neurological sense. These are brains where the signal is simply louder, more data comes in, more gets processed, more gets felt. Wild, right? Because what society usually labels as too sensitive, too intense, or too much in an intelligent person isn't dysfunction. It's a byproduct of the same wiring that makes them see 5 angles to every problem before most people have seen one. Here's the uncomfortable part. People with extremely high IQs often develop a specific relationship with their own intelligence that becomes a problem. Not because they're arrogant, though some are, and we'll get to that, but because intelligence becomes the primary lens through which they interpret everything. They trust their own analysis, almost reflexively. And that sounds like a good thing until you realize what it actually means in practice. It means they will out-argue a doctor's advice using research they read at midnight. It means they will spend 4 hours analyzing whether a relationship is working instead of simply feeling it. It means they will trust their own conclusion over someone else's lived experience because their brain generated the conclusion and their brain is usually right. Psychologists call this intellectual overconfidence, and it's different from arrogance. Arrogance is thinking you're better than others. Intellectual overconfidence is simply defaulting to your own cognition because, historically, it's been more reliable than the alternatives. It's a habit born from evidence, and it still causes real damage. The relationships suffer first. Here's something that might sting a little if you recognize yourself here. Highly intelligent people are often described by the people who love them as emotionally unavailable, not cold, not uncaring, but somehow not quite present in the emotional register that intimacy requires. And the reason is almost always the same. The analytical brain processes emotions the way it processes everything else, as information to be understood. So, when a partner is upset, the high IQ brain doesn't just feel it. It immediately starts solving it, identifying the cause, proposing solutions, mapping the logic of the situation. And the partner, who didn't want a solution, who wanted to be met in the feeling, walks away feeling unseen. It's not indifference, it's a different processing style colliding with a different emotional need. But the effect on the relationship is nearly identical to indifference. And that gap between intention and impact is one of the most painful recurring experiences in the emotional lives of highly intelligent people. Think about that. There's one more layer here that almost never gets talked about, and I think it might be the most important one. People with extremely high IQs are statistically more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and existential dread than the general population. A 2018 study published in the journal Intelligence surveyed members of American Mensa, an organization that requires a top 2% IQ score for admission, and found that they had dramatically higher rates of both diagnosed and suspected mood and anxiety disorders. The researchers proposed what they called hyperbrain, hyperbody theory. The idea is that the same neural architecture that enables high-level cognitive processing also creates a heightened reactivity in the nervous system overall. The brain that notices everything intellectually also notices everything somatically. It catastrophizes more efficiently. It models worst-case scenarios with unusual precision. It sits with uncertainty less comfortably than average because it can generate more possible outcomes from any given situation. In other words, the more intelligent the brain, the better it is at imagining everything that could go wrong. And here's the kicker. Intelligence doesn't protect you from that spiral. In some ways, it makes it harder to escape, because you can always find a logical argument for why the anxiety is justified. You can always build a rational case for why the worry makes sense. Your own brain becomes the most convincing source of distress you've ever encountered. So, what does any of this mean for you? Let's be honest. If you've been nodding along to any part of this, the intellectual isolation, the overexcitability, the analysis loop that never quite stops, the relationships that feel slightly off frequency, you probably already knew some version of this about yourself. You just didn't have language for it yet. Here's what I want you to take from this. The brain that exhausts you is also the brain that sees things others genuinely miss. The sensitivity that sometimes feels like a liability is the same sensitivity that makes you deeply perceptive, deeply empathetic when you let yourself be, and almost impossible to fool once you've learned to trust yourself. The loneliness of intellectual isolation is real, but so is the specific rare quality of the connections that eventually form between people who actually match each other's frequency. Those relationships are different. They feel like relief, and the anxiety, the catastrophizing, the modeling of worst-case scenarios. It's not evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that your nervous system is running a very complex program in a world not entirely designed for it. You are not broken. You are not arrogant. You are not too much. You are simply operating at a register that most people never encounter from the inside. The question worth sitting with isn't whether something is wrong with you. It's whether you've built a life that actually fits the brain you have, or whether you're still trying to make a mind like yours work inside a template designed for something else entirely. Because those are two very different projects, and only one of them is worth your time. If this landed somewhere specific for you, there's another side to this story. The one about what happens inside the minds of people who feel everything more intensely than the world seems to expect them to. That video is next.